Cool. There's actually one shining moment in your podcast. It was actually kind of just a side note that just like screamed out to me that was fascinating, and I wanted to give you, Tori, the opportunity to expand on it a little bit. Is when you said in passing about your Hamlet road construction people, you said, I don't mind a little corruption. And I thought that that was really fascinating, especially in light of your trying to examine the balance between a highly centralized and regulated economic system and a Darwinian economic system. Because if you have a regulated economic system, and then that Darwinian economic system kind of pokes out as a little bit of corruption, then you have kind of almost a healthy interplay between the two. And it seems like that might actually be a little bit more effective over the long term than
My motto has been when I've run for office, decentralize the power. And you're never going to get rid of corruption. Lobbying can't be made illegal because citizens have to lobby their representatives. So there is always going to be corruption. I would rather have it at the local level. There's no way that we citizens at the local level can do anything about federal level corruption. No way. We can't vote ourselves out of that problem. State level, it's also pretty hard, but if there were a lot of decisions being made about budgets and how infrastructure is going to be built, if those decisions were made at the local level where it's being built, you could keep an eye on it a lot better. But there will be, I don't like corruption, but it will be there. So we have to kind of learn to live with it and try to minimize it as best we can.
So, yeah, I mean, is it really that? I mean, when you're minimizing it, that creates, I mean, it's almost like, if you look at it from the perspective of you have the more liberal and the more traditional conservative types, and the interplay between them is what kind of regulates us moving forward through time in society. And I think between regulation and corruption, the interplay between those two is actually sort of an interesting little interplay whereby things can get done, because obviously corruption is the identification and deployment of resources in one's own favor or the favor of your in-group, right? Versus regulation, which is ostensibly for the entirety of society. So those two kind of rubbing against each other, moving forward through time, has the capacity to create better outcomes than just a hardcore regulated system or a hardcore corrupt system.
I know that when you have regulation that you can't throw any of the projects to your in-group, this does create a problem because people who can organize things well know a lot of people and have an in-group that's very competent. So when you have these regulations that don't look at the context, they may regulate out the better options because they would look like corruption somehow. I know working in the nonprofit world and the art world, it was all in group, everything. But friends would get grants, friends would get the shows, but they were, we surrounded ourselves with really talented, smart people. So, so if you have some sort of regulation that you have to, meet these numbers, so many people from this, or there's, some sort of category, you can't get this contract unless you have X, Y, and Z. Well, maybe X, Y, and Z is not the best thing, the most. So yeah, what we call corruption might just be, better planning at some level. So, there's the regulations that are in the paper that you may have read, the Free Range Humans. Um, I talk a lot about, regulations. They're necessary to try to equalize everything and take the subjectivity out of laws, and try to treat all people equally. But when they're applied too heavy-handedly, it becomes like Golem. There's this. I just got back from the Czech Republic in Prague. There's this legend of this humanoid type creature made out of clay who uh, applies the law too literally over and over again. And of course, that ends up harming the very people he's supposed to protect. And so
Right.
we've always known that the letter of the law can sometimes be more damaging than, going, well, we'll, have a little workaround here.
And that's and that's a form of intelligence in itself, right? The interplay between those and the notion of decentralized intelligence, I think, is the notion of decentralized intelligence and how you get from a centralized organizational intelligence that is really energy heavy, and then
Top down.
Right, top down, and then a collapse of that, and then a sort of rising up of a sort of spontaneous, decentralized intelligence, is definitely one of the more fascinating aspects that I'd love to hear you talk about, and potentially kind of roadmap how you see those things happening. Say we're here right now, we have a top down, almost tyrannical system. It's very energy heavy, very entropy heavy, and it is sort of by definition going to have to collapse. Now, have you kind of road mapped out from here to there as you kind of trying to write the end of your next story, as it were?
I guess I talked about that, how I'm trying to write a happy ending to Orwell's novel 1984, so it doesn't end so tragically. No, I guess not a roadmap. I mean, I wish I could, but maybe we can't. Maybe it's just impossible, because there's something about self-organizing political systems that you have to be ready at the opportune moment. And so what we're all doing is preparing ourselves for that moment. Everybody, I mean, everyone's talking about the same thing, how we all need to be a lot more self-sufficient. We all know that we need some sort of sovereign currency, get rid of central banking. That's very important. How we need to make more political decisions locally. Everyone's saying the same thing. So when the moment happens, when the collapse comes, because it's coming, hopefully some of us will just take charge of, there's no supply chain running anymore. There's no way to deliver any goods. Well, there's plenty of competent people who now occupy nodes in that supply chain that are taking orders or from other people, or who are working for larger corporations. Hopefully they'll take control of their local situation.
I've always thought, my comment has always sort of been, I don't vote, I just make sure I have my notes ready,
Yeah. I mean, as far as roadmap, I think there are some of the things that we all need to start saying now, in order to help other people know where to go. And one of them is, in the face of the climate change issues and what we're all supposed to be doing now for climate change, cutting back on agriculture, as in the Netherlands and Sri Lanka, we need to come back with, no, you need to cut back on wars. You fix the problems that you're creating before you come to farmers to ask us to make sacrifices. Stop sending weapons to Ukraine and just, making this war drag on. Russia's already won. Call home all our soldiers from, the how many 180 military bases that we know of.
Like probably 185, because there's probably one in every country, more than one in every country.
The ones we know about.
Those are the ones we know about.
I think that I think, certainly to some degree, as we were mentioning earlier, Peter Zeehan's analysis is very much that we are going to, whether we like it or not, pull back, simply because it doesn't serve us strategically anymore to really be that involved in the Eastern Hemisphere. The notion that we set up the deal, the sort of trade, the trade order after World War II, because we didn't have enough people to occupy all those countries that we were now the boss of. So effectively we're like, what? Well, how about we just make it where everybody can grow their economy, and then you guys be on our side. So that once the Iron Curtain fell in the early 90s, we've been running for 30 years on the fumes of that order that it doesn't even really serve us anymore, according to his analysis. So I think very well those wars may come to an end of their own. They may collapse under their own weight. But I think they're going to collapse under their own weight before somebody at the top of the food chain, who is funded by the military industrial complex, makes a deliberate decision to end them. So I think that's sort of intelligence manifesting itself in a way. Brian, do you have any thoughts on that?
Continuing wars is good for business. Ending them is not.
Yeah. And
I worry about analyzing things according to what would make sense. They can't continue to do this because they don't have the money for it, or it'll totally collapse our economy. I'm sorry, I use the word they, that's very vague and everything, but because that, these terrible outcomes that we're talking about and that we're afraid of and seem so ridiculous, it may be that is the goal, because there's nothing like being able to control a population if you have a total collapse, and then you can have martial law, you can issue rations, you can confiscate land, you can acquire land, and all these people with paper assets that aren't worth anything are going to want the real assets of land and homes and property and so forth. So whenever it looks like, that they won't be able to make any money if they keep doing it this way, they have all the money they could ever want. They can just make it, and they've been creating it electronically. What they want is our land.
Yeah, well, that luckily, as Mao said, we can never invade the U.S. mainland because there's a gun behind every blade of grass. So I think that may factor into the calculus of why they haven't yet, and certainly why they are doing everything they can to push that tide in the other direction.
I've given some thought about, the fall of the current order, the period of disorder before a new order rises, and how do we start talking about what we're going to build back better? Ah, God, I wish I hadn't just said that. Terrible phrase. I apologize for that. Sorry, everybody. But what are we going to build back that's going to work? That's going to be less corruption prone in the long term. I suppose it's going to more be decentralized to bottom up, serve the needs of the people, I guess is the question.
Well, it's much easier to root out a psychopath in a small community, right, than it is to root one out in a big city, in a globalized system. And I think that's just sort of a metaphor for the ability to have greater concern with the intimate details of one's surroundings. If by definition it builds back and we don't have access to the same amount of inputs and fuels and resources that we had before, it would by virtue or by definition have to be more decentralized. And if it is in fact more decentralized, then we have a greater network of feedback loops to be able to influence that our local nodes in the system.
I think it is important to talk about the mechanisms that are in place now that we're all, you know, so used to. We don't question them, that that concentrate power. And those things are creation of currency, who gets to create currency and how, taxing, regulation, issuing of patents and licenses, all those things all those duties that the government has acquired over time and didn't initially have. So to start off with, I think that money is the most important thing. And I think that what we would have to do locally is have local fiat currencies. And any government entity that can taxes the population could make a local currency by issuing credits that anybody who gets the credit could then use to pay their taxes. So this credit would have value in that local community and only in that local community. So let's say you pay your city workers with the tax credits. They could then spend them in the local farmers market, and people would want to have them because they have to pay their taxes. So if a city is going completely bankrupt and can't afford to run any of its operations anymore, it could do that in order to survive. And then you have this local currency in play. And the next thing you want to do is get rid of taxing. So I mentioned this in the paper that I wrote. Everybody hates the idea of fiat currency because it allows the people who have control of creating new money to create it whenever they want to and to give it to whomever they want to. And right now we have that with the Federal Reserve banking system, is they just create money and then loan it out to their cronies very cheap, and they loan it out to everybody else at high interest. The Federal Reserve banks loan it to governments for public infrastructure projects at pretty high interest. Oddly enough, the governments are putting their money in bank accounts, in Federal Reserve bank accounts, and then those banks loan it back, their own money at interest. So
sounds like a hell of a good scam.
Yeah. I've been involved with a public banking institute that's saying, hey, all governments should put their money in their own banks and then use their own money for their infrastructure projects so that they don't have to borrow from the Federal Reserve banks who have their money. Stupid stuff like this goes on all the time. So if a government can just create, so you don't have any more people creating money to loan it out, because that creates the boom and bust cycle. There's cheap money to borrow at low interest rates. So you have this incredible growth period. Lots of things get built, and then too many things have been built, and now there's a bust period, and that happens continually. And that will always happen as long as you are creating money as debt, backed by debt.
What's the right size for an administrative region to create that? Because certainly, we need resources from larger and from fields afar in order to, maintain the basic semblance of life as we know it, to some degree, and unless we want to go back completely to using human excrement as fertilizer, we're going to have to create some sort of trade agreement. And so what is the right? Is it like state size? I mean, because local seems a little bit too small for me in order to work as a credit system. As
a currency, yeah. I look at the local currency just as an emergency measure to be taken if and when there's a collapse before the larger, before the country can get back on its feet again, just to keep people from starving and to keep the lights on and the city functioning.
Okay, that's cool. That's good.
So that would happen in case of federal collapse and dysfunction, but your local and city governments might still be creaking along, attempting to do business and
Yeah,
maintain services.
you want the local governments to take the lead in holding everything together, which is kind of what happened in the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union fell. So yeah, as far as trade, I tend to think very myopically at just looking at the United States and not in terms of trading partners. I think I'm not as good about thinking of our relationship with the rest of the world. I have this kind of tendency to want to, come on, just stop all the global trade and we can do this. We've got resources. And so that's one area that I have a bit of a blind sight that I know I need to work on. But
well, I'm in agreement with you. I think that actually particularly the next century, the farthest we're really even going to get anything from it all is probably South America. And I think North America is going to be largely self-contained. And so when I'm talking about what is the right size administrative region to issue some sort of credit, I'm thinking that the exchange is only going to really go as far as primarily Mexico or Canada or whatever they call themselves at that point. Well, and then occasionally South America, and I don't know how that would work, but yeah, I'm in agreement with you. I think that as the world has gotten bigger, we've certainly become more. As you mentioned in the last podcast, everything has become more homogeneous and watered down, and we've been sort of turned into techno-industrial tools. And so, sort of a collapse of the techno-industrial system is, I think, a great outcome. I think obviously there is going to be massive death, destruction, and famine in the process. But you can't make a omelet without breaking a few eggs, I suppose.
yeah, it's the careful what you wish for. I mean, I've been wanting this horrible, completely, stupidly designed system to collapse. And now that it's happening, a lot of people are going to suffer.
Yeah, I think bringing back Zihan's analysis, based on his analysis, guaranteed an increase in 1 billion in chronic malnutrition, guaranteed 1 billion dead. And if China can't figure out a way to grow rice without chemical inputs, then that raises it to 2 billion dead. So I think that it's going to be brutal. And I think certainly facing our own death is I think an important part of facing this coming shift. And I think that ties back actually to what you were talking about in the podcast about your sheep's self-awareness. I think one of the things that I definitely practice daily is dying. And I think that's probably one. I think that's really one of the things that religion and some form of spirituality has a benefit for, is that it gives us some sort of solace in the snuffing out of our own individual light, and so that we can not get too much anxiety about that as this coming shift begins to materialize.
We have to be careful about that willingness to sacrifice the individual for the to see the greater good go on. Or just accept that's going to happen, but the human race will continue, and there are a lot of individuals will die, but the human race will continue. They are really trying to make use of that right now, and getting people to think of themselves as being expendable for the whole, and to sort of get used to the idea that we're just going to have to, cut back on our population, and a lot of people are going to have to die. I don't want to get too comfortable with that. I hope I would like to see the population, stop increasing so quickly and to have that S curve kind of top out a little bit and then maintain itself. I don't want to see it. I hope somehow we can avoid that. I don't think that 7, 8, 9 billion people is too many for the planet. I think that possibly we could manage.
I don't think it's mutually exclusive, certainly when I talk about being comfortable with one's own death, I don't think that really translates in my mind to being comfortable with the death of others. I mean, certainly I want to work to alleviate as much suffering for the greater good as possible, and to create systems that are iterative and infinitely repeatable over as much as that will benefit as many people as possible over the longest time horizon. I'm simply referring to a salve for our own anxiety, but certainly I do understand your point that it does not bode well for the future of humanity to view ourselves as the Borg.
Yeah, and I think your goodness and can be co-opted by people in power, because we can say, we can come to terms with our own mortality, but there are people who will take advantage of that and say, "Oh, you've come to terms." Here you go.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't mean give up your own sovereignty in that regard. What's an example of how that can be co-opted?
Oh, by don't have as many children, don't have any children, something like that.
I couldn't agree. I
A
couldn't
lot
agree
of
more
people
with
are
that.
choosing that.
Then when you start telling
Yeah.
people how many kids they should and
Yeah.
shouldn't have, then you end up with an inverted demographic
Yeah.
graph like China has, and they're facing, where all of their workers are
Yeah.
within retire or at retirement age or
And
aging out of the workforce.
in Beijing and Shanghai, this is one of the most shocking statistics from that book, was that the average woman is having 1.2 children, and so the demographic collapse of China is baked in. It's just completely baked in. So it's going to be interesting to see how that develops. I completely agree with you. The anti-human message that can be portrayed and pushed, and has very, very effectively, particularly over the last 20 or 30 years, has resulted in the manifestation of a very pathological way of looking at the world. And I agree completely with that. And the love for ourselves and our own human and our humankind, and humankind should certainly be foremost, as far as I can. Sorry, that's not a very exact sentence, but the sentiment may be translated.
A lot of people are talking about, like, a new kind of culture, or Matthias Desmet, who wrote what's the totalitarianism, a new book on totalitarianism, warning about mass formation is the name of his book. And at the end of it, he says something about, well, the reason why we've been able to be, kind of hypnotized by the propaganda and are, doing things that are bad for ourselves. We're on a self-destructive course, allowing ourselves to be locked down and, do things that harm us, destroying cattle that couldn't make it to because the slaughterhouses were closed, things like that. They're just, very, very destructive measures that were taken. He says that is all due to the mechanized philosophy that science that we've had since Descartes' time, where you have, thinking about the spiritual world is not something that you can do scientifically, so that whole area aspect of our being emotional, subjective experiences can't be analyzed by science. And then the material world can completely be analyzed and reduced to science. So both of those positions are really wrong from my point of view. My philosophy in biosemiotics is that the material world is not strictly material, that you have relationships between things that can't be quantified, and so elude scientific descriptions. And that's why with chaos and complexity science, they realize that complex systems are inherently unpredictable. Like the weather, you can't predict it after 5 days. There are too many things. It's not just that you need more information and faster computers or whatever. No, it's inherently unpredictable because of the way things relate to each other. And so that was the area of science that I wanted to explore more and understand more. I was studying complex system science at Santa Fe Institute, and then I went into this field of biosemiotics. And so it's a philosophy that doesn't allow that breach between what we now call the spiritual and the material. It allows us to think in a more holistic way about nature, to understand that we're not going to control it completely. And you want to disarm all those people who think that they can predict and control nature, and they can come up with these schemes for demographics, and they can tell everybody this is the perfect number of children that you're going to have, and this is, there aren't going to be any unforeseen consequences of this rule applied to everyone, and everyone has to use the synthetic nitrogen now, and there are too many people in science who think that if they just study harder, if they get more data, they can at last figure out how to control this situation. And complex system science and chaos theory tells us no.
Since this is ostensibly a ranching podcast, the one thing, one of the things that one of the lines that cuts through both my experience and Brian's experience is a communing with the sort of spontaneous and decentralized intelligence of a landscape. And that, I think, ties very strongly to what you're talking about. When we go out and interact with the landscape, certainly here's an example. People will ask me, how is it that your grass is growing when my grass is not growing? Nobody else's grass is growing around here, but your grass is growing, and they want some sort of answer of, well, the mechanism of the hooves allows for greater water infiltration and greater air exchange, which is true, or it has a greater rest time, so it allows itself to build its root system, which is true. But I think there is an equally important aspect that goes to what you're talking about, which is it's because the land is intelligent and it knows that it's being treated properly now, and it knows that it's being given. It knows that he or she who holds much power over it is trying to put things in order in a way that allows it to thrive and survive. And there's an intangible and a difficult to define element there that becomes manifest. And what it looks like is the grass is growing.
Would you say that this soil bacteria is providing some of that intelligence and that response to your animal activity?
Yeah, and the fungi as well. My mother refers to it as the fungal underweb. So yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you guys were talking in your previous podcast, that there's, the brain is just a bunch of individual cells. The brain doesn't have a bunch of brains. I think that the land is just a bunch of individual pieces that create a cohesive and eruptive intelligence.
Do you know the Gaia hypothesis of how we came to have a climate that's balanced and always maintains itself at a temperature and a chemical equilibrium that is conducive to life? That was a theory that was, and the idea is that the climate balances itself in a way that is intelligent. And so in a sense, there's planetary cognition. A friend of mine named Bruce Clark was a astrobiology chair at the US, I'm getting his title wrong, at the US Library of Congress. Anyway, James Lovelock died a couple of days ago. He was one of the authors of that theory, along with Lynn Margulies. Lynn Margulies was a friend of mine. You probably know she was married to Carl Sagan.
Okay.
And her son, Dorian Sagan, and Lynn Margulies have written quite a few books. And they talk about this, they really do describe how these, this whole planetary ecosystem has a kind of intelligence because of all the responses that every microbe, the fungus, the bacteria, the animals, the plants are all constantly adjusting to each other. And how can you possibly come up with a top-down rule for if this then that, if this then this, because you have all these individually intelligent beings simultaneously adapting to the situation on the fly. You can't design that. You have to rely on the intelligence of every individual player in the soil, on the land. So that's why your pasture is more intelligent than the other pastures. That's why it's more green.
Certainly. Yeah. I mean, I completely agree. Do you think, and Brian, I'll let you maybe answer some of this as well. But do you think that there's any truth to the idea that the bigger players, the more what they might refer to as the keystone species in an ecology, or basically anything with the bigger, that puts out a bigger poop, has the ability to really start moving that forward or changing that ecology? Do you think your sheep have the ability to move the ecology around faster, bigger, better, stronger than say a bacteria?
I think there's something with concentration of animals. I think there's something with herd effect, concentration of energy, concentration of animals, of the hooves, and not so much a weight thing or duration, but just having those individual beings, those individual animals in a place for a time. I think that I think that has some kind of energy effect. And it has less of an effect if it's spread out over a whole for a longer duration.
You guys are much more methodical than I am. I've very trial and error. I know that in the 10 or 12 years that I've had sheep, they're shaping the land very slowly. It's changing very slowly. Some shrubs have disappeared in an area, and oregano has disappeared in another place, and just things are changing all the time. But it's greener than it was. It used to be a cornfield many years ago, probably 30 years ago, and I think the soil was stripped.
I almost take offense to you calling me methodical. Because to some extent, everything's experimental. And
you have to write down some numbers at least. And
yeah. Legal pads. I probably go through about half a box of legal pads every year. They're just literally everywhere. There was something else that you'd said. I'll circle back.
But Hobbs, I like what you said, that example that you came up with talking about the soil being intelligent. It is, and we need that. That was basically the thesis of this paper that I sent to Brian, and we started talking about. is, the people who think that they can control nature with, mechanized farming don't realize how intelligent nature is. And they don't realize also the nature of our own intelligence. They think that our prefrontal cortex, the executive function, is making all our decisions. And it's the same metaphor who thinks that the boss, the CEO of a company is running it. How absurd is that? What we call our consciousness and the executive function in our brain is really kind of the part of the brain that's observing all the decisions that are being made by the subconscious, and then can reflect on that and can realize, I've made this decision because I, was comparing this or comparing that. And then in that consciousness of the way decisions are made can then feed back, and the subconscious can do more with that and make further decisions. But decisions are being made. Intelligence is an emergent phenomenon that's happening, just as the different entities in your pasture are all contributing to this intelligence, and there is no intelligence in one specific place. Together they are intelligent. The mind also emerges out of all these mindless neurons, so you can't place where it is that these decisions are being made. It's this ongoing reciprocity, simultaneity between all the different things that are making little tiny local decisions all the time based on their states of their neighbors around them.
Yeah, I've learned over many years with particularly with grazing, and maybe Brian can speak to this as well, that let me back up a little bit. One of the things that I hear about my granddad, who was a ranch manager back in the day and who was sort of a crazy semi-Zen person in his own right, is that he would just sit with one foot up on the bottom rung of a barbed wire fence and just look out. And the more and more that I begin to practice this high density grazing, or this eco grazing, whatever you want to call it, the more I realize that I stand in a pasture and just look, and I don't try to figure out the answer to what is the way to properly graze this pasture. I just hold open a space and then it arrives. And it's what we kind of taken to calling architect mode, and it's just sort of allowing that. And it's like, shutting off the prefrontal cortex and allowing the back end to, render in a way, and potentially maybe there's some interconnection with the landscape that's happening there as well. Like I want to be grazed this way. I need the cows over here. I want to do this, and there's no telling how deep that can go. And Brian,
I call it, I just go out and I listen to the grass. I mean, it's sometimes I have to go out and sit on top of a hill for an hour before I understand it. Sometimes I just have to go walk around, through 20 or 30 acres in a corner of the pasture, just look what's going on. And I guess you could say I'm creating a space and opening it and letting the intelligence come to me, for lack of a better term.
We take in a lot of information in our subconscious that we're not aware of. We're picking up a lot of patterns when we look around, and we hear things and we smell things that we're not processing consciously. And I think you're both talking about the process of discovering that artists often talk about. You're sort of musing and you're just taking in information, and you're not trying to analyze it yet. You're just taking it in. And then it's sort of the information sort of self-organizes literally in your subconscious. And then you And then you realize what the solution is. It comes to you like an epiphany. That's, stereotypical artist, way of doing things. But of course, that's everybody who's really in touch with, a complex problem. And so if everyone's like that, every node in your ecosystem is made up of individuals who are listening really hard and paying attention, everybody will work really well together or better.
There's one thing that occurred to me, and this in listening to your previous podcast with Brian, and it was that you being a philosopher who writes papers, and the title of your last paper being Free Range Humans, and maybe it is because I grew up in the ranch culture, the American West ranch culture, that I think, and I would love to see you spend some time on some big ranches across the American West and seeing if there's an interesting seed of what an almost sort of cultural or philosophical seed of free range American Western culture that's out there. Because I've always felt, and once again, I'm probably very, very biased, that it's an interesting structure, right? You have ranches, which are little kingdoms, and then you have these people who are sort of running it and organizing it, and who've created kind of a city, and ranchers are basically just public administrators for a city of cattle and the subsequent ecosystem that's around it. And that has produced a particularly independent variety of human.
I've had almost that exact same analogy in my head before, Hobbs.
Oh, interesting. So anyway, that was just a thought that occurred to me today that I would love to read your observations of, after having read your paper on biosemiotics. I would love to read your observations of how a crusty old rancher looks like a free range human, or doesn't.
The American cowboy. A mythical being to people in Europe and in Russia. And I was in Russia during the lockdown, and people said to me that they were just flabbergasted that the American cowboy was allowing all these things to be done to them, and to their freedoms to be restricted. The American cowboy, the American, a lot of the reading that I have done is with the transcendentalists in terms of this American self-reliance and so forth is from Emerson and Thoreau and C.S. Peirce, that group of thinkers. But I grew up in Dallas, Texas, so that's my original conception of the independent American. And writing the paper, I thought of myself, as I hadn't really before, as kind of a governor of my farm, and that I could see that in relationship to my sheep, I am treating my animals like politicians and leaders want to treat the people, kind of domesticate them and so forth. And so in a way, I was kind of coming to terms with that. How can I be that best governor? I don't want to just let my sheep out. I don't want to turn them loose and make them fend for themselves in the winter. I want to provide for them. I want to protect them. I want to provide some security for them. But how can I do that without taking away their independence and their own free will? So I tried to be, paint a picture of myself as the best kind of governor for a little tiny farm, as kind of a model for a political organization. And so if I were to come out and look at big ranches and think about the American cowboy, that would be a bigger picture, and it's a bigger operation. But that's what what we all have to do. We look at our own household, and we also want to run our household as parents. Don't treat your kids like they're, don't lock them up in a cage and tell them what to do. Give them some responsibility and some freedom, and so we have to, get larger and larger. And so you take the model that I created on my little 5-acre farm, how does that apply to a farm with thousands of acres?
Interesting. Well, yeah, I mean, that is sort of the prevailing debate in the so-called regenerative world, is what is the proper political and ecological orientation of the operation, such that the animals, the people, and the ecology are properly provided for and create the best outcome over the longest time horizon. That's, and I think there is the bigger your operation gets, the more difficult that becomes, until you get to be the size of, the planet. So
well, the bigger you get, you have to be made up of a lot of smaller entities that are doing the same kind of thing. It can't be like a hierarchy where there's just one person at the top, giving the orders. A big ranch has to be made up of a lot of little ranches, I guess, little mini herds, and who have equal control over their own little territory. So I don't know how you do something like that with a big ranch, if you can think of it as having a lot of small ranches and smaller projects within a larger one.
Sure, they call them camps.
Yeah, or division.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly, obviously, it definitely fractalizes as it goes up or down.
Yeah.
And certainly that's important. But anyway, I just think I think this has been really lovely to just sort of the central theme of self-organizing intelligence is just, I think, I mean, maybe that's when we keep looking for a roadmap, or we keep looking for what is it going to look like. It's going to look like, and that's why as this old order sort of withers and gives rise to a new one, it's just simply, we have to trust that intelligence self-organizes, and which is why, in our previous conversations, Brian and I always kind of come up with, yes, save seeds, etc., but also form relationships with your community. Like that's the real long-term investment, I think, in terms of creating a sustainable future.
And I want to say something too about the paradigm of Darwinian selection as weeding out the unfit and creating an environment where you have the most fit. You said a moment ago, looking for the best way to do things. We can only look for one of the best ways to do something. There are many best ways, and there are many okay ways. There are many ways that are good enough for the moment. And so I think it's important that we, don't try to optimize anything ever. Nature actually doesn't do that. And I even natural selection tends to select for adaptability often than the best fit to a particular environment, because most organisms need to adapt. That's the best, the fittest thing you can be is adaptable. So there's, the idea of competition too is selection is good in a way in that it tends to it tends to eliminate the things that are kind of bringing a herd down, and it but it doesn't create anything new. Natural selection has no creative powers. It can only narrow options. It can only select away the things that are particularly detrimental. And so self-organization is the other countering force to natural selection. Self-organization is the force that creates new new, cooperative entities, new relationships between things that have this synergistic effect. And in nature, when you get the most evolution is when you don't have any selection acting at all, and there are enough resources available for all animals to survive, even if they're not particularly fit. It's just so easy to gather food that there's very few predators. In those kinds of conditions, you get a great amount of diversity. So there's a lot of speciation events, just a lot of variety when selection is not acting.
And then inevitably that's partnered with a pruning period.
And then that's partnered with a pruning period. Yeah. So, you have this relationship going on all the time. So, too much of our philosophy in economics and in business and in evolutionary theory is focused on natural selection and what it does, but self-organization is equally important.
It seems like it's much, perhaps that's because it's much easier to articulate as a result of the Descartes scientific materialist world that we have all sort of evolved in, and the language of self-organization and intelligent and spontaneously manifesting intelligence is very difficult for us to articulate.
Yeah, and it starts to sound to people like we're, not being scientific anymore because we're talking about the intelligence of the soil and, things like that. But that's just because we have a really pared down scientific approach that is not very good about understanding the relationships between things. It's very good at sort of digitizing everything and thinking about discrete things, and thinking about things that can be counted. But relationships it's harder to quantify them. So our language needs to catch up to a new understanding of how the world works, I think.
I think that to some degree, and I apologize for the generality of this statement, but I can't not say it. And to some degree, that is, I think, the tension between the scientific materialists and the people who want to talk about God. That spontaneous arising of intelligence. I think maybe there's something particularly in regardless of what religion you are, there's a seed of something inside of people that they want to talk about that intelligence. They want to talk about that spontaneous arising, that sort of non-Darwinian element of existence. And the best that we've been able to do as a result of our linguistic training is to just say God.
Yeah. I am not a religious person at all, but people who are religious quite often use my work in biosemiotics because I try to scientifically discuss these things that you're not supposed to be able to discuss, these things that we often call spiritual or immaterial. And I was trying to bring this up when I was talking about Matthias Desmet before, where he felt like, and he said that the reason why we have these problems is that people have gotten away from a kind of spiritual way of viewing the world. And I would agree. I would just call that spiritual way of understanding the world a semiotic one. I think that the processes that create these, almost supernatural spiritual processes are semiotic processes, and that we can understand them in that way. And so maybe that's just new language to describe a spiritual process. There are a number of authors who have taken what I've written and they say, see, this is the kinds of, this is like a divine process when you talk about emergence this way. And I'm perfectly happy with that. if that's a way to get this kind of spiritualism back in the discussion, back in our culture, because not everybody is religious, and people will criticize, spiritual readings of agriculture if you're not Wendell Berry or something. And so I want to provide the language that can help everybody come back to, reconnecting with what we call the spiritual. Yeah, and I'm doing that I think I may have mentioned that to Brian before, that I'm doing that in my fiction too. I've got a collection of short stories called Chance That Mimics Choice. And, Wordsworth had all this, nature poetry, trying to articulate the spiritual in nature. And, that fell out of fashion with the postmodernism and with, the mechanistic view of the world just won't read Wordsworth anymore. Well, I've been writing narratives that try to bring back that sense of, I don't call it the spiritual, I call it the semiotic. But basically, I'm looking at the same phenomenon. I'm trying to describe the same phenomenon in our connectedness with the natural world.
Okay. So I thought of something I was going to say earlier, and this does kind of tie in. You were talking about how the changes you've seen on your farm have taken a long time, 10 years. And it's just, I think it was specifically, you were talking about the sheep, since the sheep and some of the brush was starting to kind of disappear and change shape. And I've seen this myself. So I've been here, on the ranch every day for like 15, 16 years now. When a natural system changes, it changes very slowly. And I found that any rapid change is generally not for the better. So rapid change would be something like, a new species coming in to colonize, which, that's a whole other argument. And I've been kind of sitting here mulling this over for the last half hour or so about the time scale of intelligence. Does a smaller intelligence express itself in a shorter time scale, and does a larger intelligence take a longer time scale to express itself? So I think some of the conversation was about, the planet, the soil kind of having an interconnected intelligence. Do we just not exist on a long enough time scale to understand it? Evidenced by, seeing just a relatively, what we would think of as a relatively minor change on a landscape over 10 years.
I would guess that our lifespans are about right for us to develop a very intelligent homestead. I think it'll take a lot longer for the country to become intelligent, the United States of America to develop some intelligence. That'll take a very long time. We'll have to all get our homesteads thinking more intelligently first. But I like that you brought that up, that the intelligence does work. Sometimes intelligence can rapidly discover new things that in the way the human brain works, we can have these epiphanies that are very sudden, and we can learn things instantly without a lot of trial and error and without a lot of training. And that's only through our kind of specifically organic intelligence that we have, where we have all these things simultaneously feeding into the process all the time. So only this kind of organic intelligence is capable of those epiphanies, those insights that immediately solve many, many problems. So maybe that is something. Maybe we can get out of this mess sooner than later if we let these epiphanies emerge, and all of us are more connected to our lives and what we do. But definitely, in terms of slogans for how to look at the future, not sustainable growth or anything like that, but slow. The worst thing I think for all of us has been throwing a lot of money into the economy at different periods of time, and you get this rapid development on anything. That's why the monetary system is the first thing that needs to be changed. Very, very careful how quickly we build new structures. We have to think about them first and live with it and see how it works. And
Right. Yeah. So that's why, Joel Salatin says, if you put a temporary fence in a place and it works for 3 years, then build a permanent one.
Or just leave it there and don't ever pick it up. Then it becomes a temporarily permanent fence. That sounds like something I might do. So we're talking about, the currency and devaluation. And note I made earlier, and something I've been kind of thinking about is, when we're doing this paper to digital transition, and primarily the focus that we've kind of been discussing, and some other people I've been discussing from this frame of mind is the central bank digital currency, or central controlled digital currency, similar to what they have in China. And if you hear a government talk about it, they say, oh, it's nothing like what they have in China, but I have a feeling it's going to be exactly the same thing. So if they're going to put everything on the digital register, tie our personal records to, digital banking account, to a social credit score, to how much, fiat dollars you have in the bank, are they going to do the same to property and asset records? Are they going to be digitized on some sort of blockchain? And the reason I'm asking is because that's not really done, even though we've been trying to digitize all the paper records since like 1986. The federal government's been trying to go paperless, and it hasn't happened yet. So like abstracts and certificates of title, here where I'm at, we go back to 1883 at the earliest, 1882 ish for land grant. I can only imagine what it's like to get like a title opinion on your property, Tori. Like I can imagine that that's probably a pretty obscenely thick document. So what are they going to take all the property records and tie them to a digital record, like some kind of, I don't know, NFT, non-fungible token?
Well, yeah, maybe, or you're just going to own nothing. That'll simplify things quite a bit.
The amount of energy that it takes to run, say, even like Facebook's servers or Apple's servers is completely, to use the word that you're talking about earlier, non-sustainable. It's just not going to happen. It's just not to mention the energy, but also the water is just not going to be available to keep all of those records going and cool and accessible, and everybody getting a hold of them on their iPhones. I mean, it's just I just don't think that system can hold itself up.
Yeah, it's the blockchain is very energy intensive. So, I mean, I think that needs to be our response when they say, "Oh, we've got this, great new digital, no, it's not sustainable. It's too energy intensive. Absolutely not."
And just sitting here thinking about it, there could be a time in the future where property boundaries aren't necessarily legally enforceable because there's not a method, there's not a functioning legal system to enforce them.
Smith and Wesson.
And so something else I've been thinking about, it was actually on my list that we started with, was what, if any, sorts of government are going to survive into the post-order world? I mean, none of them are going to make it through intact. And there's something new going to be born. And with every birth, there's always blood. The question is, I guess maybe, and nobody's going to know, but how long do we think the current system is going to kind of keep creaking along? And are they going to try to build something different before it breaks? Or how do we see the break happening? Tori, I'd like you to go first.
Well, the one thing that I would hope survives is our basic constitution, which I think in its simplicity was pretty well designed, with enumerating the rights of the individuals being the most important thing, and not the rights of the government to do things to you. Maybe the one thing is how they envisioned the system of checks and balances with the legislators, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. It hasn't really worked out in terms of the checks and balances that they imagined, because each of those branches just assumed too much power. I think one of the ways to fix that might be to not really give legislators any laws to create. You know, we have 650 new laws or new bills voted on every year. Like,
Or make it a much higher bar to get one passed and much easier to get one repealed.
Yeah, you know, I mean, what are some of your favorite acts that you would like to see continued?
There aren't any. There really aren't any. Every one of
I mean,
them.
we can talk about some, you know, like Social Security. It's nice that, you know, people can retire and they know they're going to have a little bit of income, but then there's always unintended consequences. Now families don't take care of their parents, you know, so you lose that intergenerational feedback that was super important for families. So,
Yep.
you know, so part of your question was, what do you think will survive the collapse? I hope the post office will survive. It's the one, you know, it's the one, you know, libertarians always talk about how much they hate the post office. I like the post office.
I don't mind the post
It's the
office.
one. No, I mean, it's necessary for a democracy that you have communication system, right? And it does pay for itself in that nobody pays taxes to maintain the post office. You just pay if you use it, and so that's a much better model for any kind of government service. Is if you need it, you pay for it instead of being taxed.
Isn't that kind of the overall thesis of Kevin Costner's movie, The Postman? In a post-apocalyptic America, he, you know, he
like the Pony Express, the hero,
right.
No, I didn't see that movie, but
Well, yeah.
I don't know. So my answer is basic infrastructure. That's what I would like to see. You know, some sort of communication lines survive, and transportation lines, roads, people maintaining roads.
I want to scream, but my roads, who will build the roads?
So I didn't get to finish my sentence before with the fiat money. It can't be debt backed. Debt backed currency doesn't work. But if you only create greenbacks, because that's what we had before in Lincoln's time, you create greenbacks only to build and maintain public infrastructure, and for no other reason. Not for war, not for welfare, not to pay politicians' salaries or regulators or anything. You can only create currency to build public infrastructure. That way you don't have to tax to do it. That way you don't have to borrow to do it. And then once you build that public infrastructure, you could charge reasonable user fees to use the infrastructure. And then we don't need to tax.
So would another way to say that be the only way to distribute created money into the greater population is through building infrastructure for the public?
Right. And then the local regions could oversee that infrastructure project. The complete budget is published online. Everybody can look at it and see whether or not the money is being spent And civil engineers should do the constructing, not a third party corporation who's going to take some profit off the top of it. We eliminate that. Just, hire good workers and fire them if they're not good.
In that scenario, though, what incentive do the workers have to do a good job for a low cost? So, okay, I guess I could, there's, when I'm hiring something done, I want, the right person for the right job, the right price. When a contractor is going out, they're concerned with other performance metrics. When the government's doing it, they just want the lowest cost and they're not measuring any outcomes. So how does that translate to a verified outcome system?
Well, I think it might be a mistake to always try to keep the cost low. And you're going to do that if you have to tax people to build public infrastructure, and you're going to try to keep the cost low if you're going to have to borrow money. But if you can create that money to do it, then you can think about the long term. You can build the best that money can buy. That's going to last, hundreds of years instead of just 30 years. Money isn't really an object in a way. You're going to pay for the best workers. And so, I mean, yeah, you don't want to, overdo it or whatever within reason. But when you can create the money for the infrastructure, you can build the best, and you don't have to cut corners. You don't have to penny pinch. And as far as the worker is going to be motivated to do a good job because they'll get fired if they don't do a good job for that, for a reasonable salary.
Just to some degree, I think that's what, to some degree, that's kind of what China has done, right? China's debt to GDP ratio has increased by 800% over the last decade, right? So they've said, well, we have a printing press. We can keep everybody happy by using our printing press. And so ultimately they have been able to assuage any political frustrations from the populace by making sure that there's enough money moving around. And so sadly now they have, a ton of infrastructure projects that nobody needs or wants. And so then the question, and we saw that almost blow up this year with what was that company? I'm having a hard time remembering. But how do you govern that? How do you put a governor on that? How do you put a quality assurance team?
Yeah. So yeah, the worst thing that could happen with greenbacks for infrastructure is that you'll have a lot of bridges to nowhere, or like you have in China where they built these smart cities and nobody lives in them. Yeah, that's a real problem in China. So if Ellen Brown with Public Banking Institute said that the creation of money could be based on per capita, how many, so that there's some sort of natural limit that you can't go beyond, so that you have like a budget ceiling or whatever, and it's based on the number of people. I am not an economist, so I can't think that through further, but I think Ellen Brown would be able to and come up with a very good answer for that. And going to, where's the quality control? If this region or this state or this city or this town gets allotted a certain amount of money per capita for an infrastructure project, maybe the people will be more interested to keep an eye on it and say, we don't want to spend more than that for this project because we have these other 3 projects that we also want to do. So there would be a participatory budget discussion among the people. And if that's what we had to spend our time on, managing, how our local governments spent the infrastructure money that they got from the federal government or from the Treasury, then we could, use our time talking about those things, and we wouldn't be bothered with talking about politicians' personalities all day. And,
Have you read any Gail Tverberg? Have you ever read any of her work?
I'm sorry, I just got a message from my husband that says the canner is on, and I forgot I'm canning food.
Oh, okay.
On here. So let me just do a quick calculation. It's been on about an hour and a half. Yeah, could you turn it off now? Thank you.
Perfect. All right. Yeah, you got to make, that's the theme of this whole conversation is you got to make sure that the canning is right. You can't even talk about government if you don't have anything to eat. So you got to make sure that the cans are properly oriented. Yeah. So have you read any Gail Tverberg?
No.
She's a retired insurance actuary who writes on the nexus between energy and finance. And her basic idea is that that global GDP has tracked right alongside of energy availability. So one of the things that occurred to me while I was thinking about this is that people don't have time to participate in a meaningful way in the intimate details of their life because our system is set up so that they must go out and chase debt created dollars. And if GDP is directly correlated to a rise in energy availability, they are actually out going and trying to find a place in the energy pipeline to capture those resources and deploy them in a way that will bring them more debt-backed dollars so they can continue doing this. I'll give you a solid example. And the solid example is that people ask me, how do you have time to move your cows 4 times a day? How do you have time to do that? And my answer is because I'm not on a tractor. So I have the ability to engage with the intimate details of the management of my property more because I don't have to spend time, because I've arranged the system so I don't have to spend as much time burning fossil fuels in the pursuit of dollars as the most people in our economy are sort of trapped doing.
Yeah, I think some people would say the same thing to me. How do you have the time to can all those vegetables? I almost worked full time at it for about 3 months a year. I do about 7 quarts a day. Yes. How do you have time? Well, you often, I put this cabbage here because I was going to chop it up for coleslaw while I was on this call with you. Usually I'm multitasking, and I guess I'm just so involved in the conversation I'm not doing this work, and normally I would be.
Well, that's a good sign.
Yeah. But so yeah, a lot of the things that I think about, what do I do here is what can I do without having to depend on the system outside for energy. And I also energy, for our entire economy to be so dependent upon the availability of energy, let me just say, that's a natural resource that was created millions of years ago, and the people who are pulling it out did not create that. They're using a finite resource that they are not responsible for creating. And so it really, I don't want to sound like a hippie or anything, but that really does, all finite natural resources do belong to all people on earth, or in the given country, let's say, present and future. And so I don't think that for-profit companies should have access to those finite resources that really belong to all the people on the land. And I believe in ownership and capitalism and entrepreneurship, but I don't believe in the private ownership of natural resources that you did not create. So as far as energy goes, I would rather see all our oil fields nationalized. The federal government owns a lot of these lands now anyway, and leases them out. And you could take the profit out of our energy use, because these oil companies, they have a lot of profit. They're siphoning off a lot of profit. And if we could run an energy industry as a nonprofit, that's, the problem with government running something is they have this top-down control, and you have all this power up at the top, and they just like the for-profit oil companies will siphon money out of the system. So in order to run that properly, you would have to have, again, some sort of distributed management system where everybody is, has input on decision making. The people that are in the area where the pipeline is going to be going through, they have input. The people that own the land where there's fracking going on have input, and they would be much better regulators than a federal regulator. If you own the farm where the fracking is being done, you're going to be a much better regulator.
I'm probably going to be a much harsher critic on my place of a saltwater spill than the Kansas Corporation Commission is. I guarantee you, I'm a lot more upset about any saltwater spill than the KCC is.
Well, yeah. I'm sad to announce that I'm probably need to go move some cows here shortly. But I did want to try to answer Brian's question a little bit earlier in the. I think Tori, you did a fabulous job articulating what you hope survives. I think the post office and the Constitution are two really good ones. And as what it looks like, I think that if you sort of just, and this is sort of a gut analysis, but also looking at several inputs like interest rates and accompanying metrics, I think that we're going to see a convergence of real problems right around 2030. And I think right around 2030, we're going to have a massive crisis. And I think we're going to have 10 hard years or so. And then around 2040, we're going to start to see some self-organizing systems. I think the first, whatever sort of acute crisis rises, which I think there will be at some point an acute crisis. I think that's going to happen somewhere right around 2030. We'll see if there's a little prelude here in at the 2024 election that may be sort of the beginning of the conversation. But I think by the 2040s, things will have begun to settle out. That's sort of my best guess.
I've got a different start date. Tori, you got anything?
Much sooner. Let's take bets, huh?
I'm 2026.
Yeah.
2026?
Yep, I'm in 2026.
Well, certainly it is possible that COVID has moved things forward a little bit. But I think that we still have some room to run with low interest rates that'll move us, that'll keep the zombie moving a little bit farther down the line. We'll see. I'll put $100 in.
It depends on the weather, I think. If we have a terrible drought that continues, or if something else like that.
Well, we're getting that right now, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And I don't see that ending anytime soon. We'll just have to see.
Yep.
So you very well may be right.
We'll keep moving those cows.
I certainly will. Thank you, Brian, for organizing this. I very much appreciate it.
Hey, I've really enjoyed it. It's been kind of nice just being able to sit back and let the smart people in the room have a conversation, and I can kind of absorb it. So I really appreciate that, guys, and listeners. I hope you guys appreciate it too.
Right.
Thanks, guys. Good talking to you.
Good to talk to you too. All right. Nice to meet you, Tori.
Bye.
All right, gang. Have a great week.